fierce,
fascinating,
fearless,
fabulous,
feminine,
femme, free,
fired up. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the mothership of all things feminism. This is Fired Up, a podcast that celebrates women who are fearless in the pursuit of what sets their soul on fire. Women who break the mold and dare to dream. Grab a seat and take your place in a safe space for bold conversations on charting our own path. Hello and welcome to the very first full episode of Fired Up. This episode is going to be one of a series under feminism and family. So today we'll be covering the very touchy subject of dowry. I happen to have quite a few personal opinions on this, but I also would like to cover it from a more objective point of view, and I would love to hear about your perspectives on this particular subject, because I tend to find that sometimes my opinions are very, very different from what the majority holds. I'm completely comfortable with that, but I'm also happy to have dialogue. In fact, I was thinking of doing this episode solo because I'm just going to lay groundwork and give the idea of what this is all about and what I think about it. And then maybe over time, I might find someone to come and speak to me about their personal opinions on this particular subject, and maybe even from the pro side. So I might be getting ahead of myself, but yeah, you will come to find along the episode that I do have opinions against the practice, but not essentially as an overall thing, much more as a personal take. And maybe, even based on this episode's topic, I might be proposing that we do away with some of these practices. Of course, if my argument is not convincing enough, then you might want to come and convince me of why it needs to continue or in what context it is still or could remain relevant. So why don't we begin with kind of distinguishing between dowry and bride price. I find that a lot of people often call the practice of bride price, which is much more common in the African context and particularly in Kenya. Most of the time it's conflated with the idea of bride price. So what is essentially practiced here in Kenya is bride price. So that is the offer or payment of property or money or gifts from the groom's side of the family, or the groom and his family, to the bride's family. So one of the ways that I came to kind of think, wait, I want to talk about this, and it's really something that's been on my mind and something I would love to have much more dialogue around, and even kind of question why we continue to practice these traditional practices, if they're relevant in today's world, because there's so many stories that kind of negate the idea of continuing to practice them. So let's do some groundwork, and I'll give you a little story of how I came to kind of want to share this topic or speak about it. This is going to be one of a series on feminism and family, and of course family usually starts with marriage or the wedding. So in African context, that would come up as the payment of bride price or different practices within different communities. As I mentioned earlier, it's actually something that's common around the world. The practice of both dowry and bride price, or dowry or bride price, would be found in Africa, in Asia, and parts of South America. In most African cultures, especially in modern day, what would have been paid as bride price would be cattle or food or certain, items, so kind of bartered. But now in today's world, what they do is that they translate this into monetary value. So let's say, for example, the cost of a cow or the cost of a goat, and the number of cattle that has been agreed upon by the two families is converted into monetary value, and then now the exchange is that the groom's family pays money to the bride's family. This varies from other countries around the world. In some, it's actually the woman. For example, I've heard of certain Muslim cultures where the woman is given an item or jewelry or actually physical items that are of value that she can now then use in case she needs them when she moves to her husband's side of the family, or if she needs to leave for some reason. So that's sometimes like a form of protection or a source of extra, resource in case she might need it along the way. So a lot of people seem to continue to honor this age-old practice, and even those of us who didn't really grow up in cultures that we were even aware of the traditional practices that were ongoing in our cultures. So I, for example, was born and raised in the city, and I had very little actually interaction with traditional practices because my parents are Christian, for example, and I actually was unaware of a lot of traditional practices because a lot of this stuff was lost along the way, through colonization and adaptation of modern culture. A lot of our parents and grandparents hardly even spoke of traditional practices. Another reason maybe that I would not have as much information about these traditional practices is because I also didn't speak the language of my parents' traditional culture. So I actually consider my mother tongue to be Kiswahili, which is local language, but my parents' mother tongue is actually very different. And even though I understand it, those people who understand it but don't speak it, one of the ways that I was robbed of kind of learning about these traditional practices was by not knowing the language. So that means that interactions with people who would have a wealth of knowledge on this subject matter, I wouldn't have as much interaction with them, and so then not have access to this information. So that aside, I do recognize that it's still something that's practiced even with people who haven't been in touch with their traditional or culture outside of that kind of stage of life. And I find it very interesting that kind of we can pick and drop things at our convenience or at different stages in life. And I find that really interesting. So anyway, for me, I obviously didn't have an attachment to this practice because I didn't have as much knowledge of it. And I also then formed my own individual opinions about what it is and how I perceive it and whether or not I even like the idea of it. And it's also interesting to kind of note that how does that kind of traditional practice that was, in those times, for example, even how families were formed, the reasons for that were very different from the reasons that families are formed today. So a lot of families today are formed on the basis of a couple meets, they fall in love, and they decide, I think we have the same kind of ideas and values and similarities, and I would like to spend my life with you and raise a family with you because I can see that happening in a way that we both agree on and that we can work together on. In the past, of course, marriage was based on very different reasons. It was either transactional, it was a way to connect families, it was a way to exchange even, like women were given away by their parents or their fathers to a wealthy family just to also raise the status of the family and so on. So these things, they do happen in smaller kind of levels at the moment, but largely it was a very different world back then from what it is now. So it's interesting to see how these two can kind of merge in the modern world. And some of the ways that happens is, it happens seamlessly, I suppose, in some ways, because some people can really live in both worlds comfortably, and then in some cases then it's kind of there's an adjustment there that even starts to kind of lose the texture of the reason why this happened in the first place. So in modern day, one of the ways that it starts to lose its even meaning, its strength and so on is that in the current age, women are much more empowered in the way of education and access to opportunities, which means that they also have the opportunity to amass wealth on their own as individuals. And sometimes it also means that in certain couples that the woman has much more in terms of resources than her partner. And so I've heard of cases in which the woman has actually paid her bride price through the husband. And then it's like, well, what's the point of paying it if you're the one who's paying it? So I do wonder what, outside of sentimental value, what are the reasons that people continue to practice these traditional practices that may have lost their relevance in modern day. Another thing that has changed in modern day as far as, reducing the relevance, I think, of practices such as bride price is that especially currently it has been really commodified and has been made to be very, very, very expensive and hardly affordable to majority of people. So it can begin to cause friction among couples, or it can cause a lot of strain to a young couple that's just starting out in life. You have to pay all this money to an older couple that's ideally supposed to have established themselves, so that is the parents of the bride, and you and your husband, that is the bride and the groom, are just starting life out, and you probably have limited resources and need as much as you can, because potentially you're also going to have kids, and that's also a cost on its own. And so that's just something that makes me wonder whether it's something that should continue, or it should be even, I guess, mandatory. Yeah, that's what I was wanting to say. If it should be mandatory, or if it should start to become something of a choice, maybe we like to do it for sentimental values, or maybe we even change how we practice it so that there's kind of gifting on both sides rather than one-sided. So I might have defaulted already to kind of giving my own take of what this is all about, but I just want to cover it on a more objective perspective, and that is to kind of mention the pros and the cons of this practice, the practice of bride price. One of the pros of this practice would be that it's an opportunity for two families to foster a relationship over time. So in certain cultures, like the Kikuyu culture, for example, they have a series of ceremonies or events in which both sides of the family meet and eat together and speak together, and of course the gifts are included, or the payment of the bride price is included. But it seems like the essence of this whole ceremony or the whole practice is to really bring these families together, have them get to know each other, because a lot of times they come from very different worlds and they do not know each other until the couple come together and then introduce each other to each other's families. So that could be a pro of the practice of bride price. Another pro would be that it is an opportunity to increase resources on the bride side of the family. So if you are a little bit down on money and your daughter gets married, then it's an opportunity to kind of elevate your finances. And I don't know how, so that's, I'm not going to put any opinion on it, but that's actually could be seen as, a reason why you should have this practice going on. So one of the old ideas, or when I say old ideas, it sounds a little bit judgmental. So one of the ways that it was initially, the reasons why it was initially created was for the groom to basically show his commitment to the bride. So by giving up a substantial amount of his resources, it was kind of a gesture of, I am serious about this and I would love to bring this woman into my life, and she is going to be taken care of and she's going to be treated well, because also a lot of communities considered that the marriage of a woman was her leaving the family or her side of the community and joining her husband's side of the community. So in that case, then if the man was to pay a bride price, then it would be to say, thank you for letting her go, this really valuable resource, quote unquote, and thank you for letting her go, and here's a show of appreciation via bride price. I guess I could compare that to what is much more common now in the Western world, and that is the engagement ring. So the engagement ring is quite often a very priced or very valuable piece of jewelry, often made of diamonds and so on, and it is, in a way, I guess, some kind of guarantee of, here's something really valuable that you can use in case things don't work out. And if you've given up a lot of yourself in terms of your opportunities to raise income and so on by having a family and all that, you have a chance to recover in case things turn sour or something tragic happens, like the loss of a loved one and so on. So I guess you could actually conflate it with, or see it as the alternative, the African alternative to what is Western tradition, and that is the engagement ring. Well, another very clear indication of why it was a good thing is because that was actually the symbol of marriage in African traditional culture. So when people met to do this exchange, have the conversations around the bride price and, negotiate and so on, as well, that was also a very social event. It was also like a wedding. So it was the traditional equivalent of a wedding. If one had not partaken in this ceremony, then they were not considered by the culture, by the society, as married people. A reason for dowry, because I'm actually mostly going to speak about bride price because that's what's relevant in our context. The dowry, which is actually much more common in India, for example, is, or can be seen, so this is a pro, it can be seen as a protection of the bride in case of any tragedy or incidences where she might need to flee or might need to continue to survive in a bad situation. So the dowry is actually a resource that she has within her own ownership, because a lot of times, again, in patriarchal or patrilineal societies, it was much more the man who would have access to land, money, and opportunities to work and so on. And not just opportunities, but opportunities as well, in the sense that if the woman has, decided to stay at home and have children and raise them, then she would give up the opportunity to go out and work. And in a lot of cultures, unlike ours, where you can have help in that process, so you can get back to work and you can have people working for you and so on. In other societies, you don't have access to that. It's way too expensive, and so it does bring in the use of a dowry as a way for the woman to continue to survive. And similar to that, in a lot of Muslim cultures that I've heard of and even read about in books, sometimes fictional, but often these things are based on truth, is that the woman is given jewelry, very valuable jewelry, so gold and so on. And the reason for that is that she has something of her own that she can hold on to and use again in case of emergencies. And so that could be seen as a sort of guarantee or an emergency fund for the bride. So one of the things that I would say is a con against the practice of bride price is that it could be seen as transactional and almost like the purchase of a bride. And this is something that you hear about quite often, where even sometimes with couples, when they start to have disagreements, that the man would hold it over the woman's head and say, I paid for you, or you might have to return the money if things don't work out, and so on. So, and other ways that this can also be seen as a very transactional and kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth practice is a lot of cultures, especially in modern day, have really raised the bar and have really raised the price of bride price. Initially, it would have come from a very goodwill kind of place, and it was a potentially beautiful thing that was shared and everybody was happy to do it. But nowadays you do find a lot of it is kind of made to be exorbitant and very hard to reach, so that even the people who are expected, so that is the man who is expected to pay the bride price, feels a lot of financial pressure, and that can also sour the relationship, I believe. I've heard of stories, for example, during these ceremonies where the groom is coming into the compound to meet the bride and the family and start the negotiations, and right at the door they're being asked for money or they want to be allowed in and so on. And I just wonder if people take these kind of things seriously, or if they don't, or if they're able to actually pay this money, if they're prepared, or if that could cause some friction in the relationship between the man and his bride. Also, in the wrong context, this could be used as a threat or blackmail. So in certain cases, people have maybe difficulties in the relationship after the payment of the bride price, after the marriage, that is the traditional marriage, and the groom or the husband now might tend to use this as a way to kind of hold power over the woman and say, you need to do this and you need to do that because I paid the bride price. And also because the bride price was very high, likely, then it's maybe impossible or difficult for the bride or her family to pay back the bride price, or there's even an unwillingness on the bride's side of the family. And so then that puts the woman in a situation where she's not able to have agency or make decisions that are right for her, that feel good for her, but rather are more coerced towards the needs of the husband. So along with that mentality of the purchase of a bride or the payment of a bride, and these are ideas that are not even just relevant here, but along with that idea is also the higher chances of gender-based violence. Now, this is something maybe that could be arguable, but I can see it being an excuse that's used by a man who's already potentially violent against his wife to kind of treat her as an object or a property rather than as a human being, as an equal. And so that could lead to gender-based violence. And I'm sure that I would love to hear from you if you feel like this is actually something that happens, because I've read a few studies around it and some have not been able to prove that that increases the chances of gender-based violence. But I think it is potentially something that could cause even more chances of violence or aggression towards the woman by the man who feels kind of like he owns her because he paid a bride price. The fifth con that I would mention is that it kind of feels one-sided. And you can argue with me on this one, but I would like to imagine that both parties should be considered valuable, so equally valuable. So if there is an exchange of sorts, then I would assume that the exchange would come from both sides. And there are situations where that is done. For example, I know in the Kamba culture that one of the ways that these ceremonies of getting to know each other happen is that the groom's family visits the bride's family and they cook for them and basically serve them. And it's a gesture of saying, hey, when this lady comes to join our side of the family, she's going to be taken care of, she's coming to a good family. And I think when it comes from that pure place where it's just show us who you are because you're complete strangers to us and we want to just be sure that where we're sending our family member is to a place where they're going to be safe and loved and cared for, then it's a pro. But then the con is also that in cases where this isn't done on both sides, then it does feel like one member of the couple is considered more valuable than the other. Of course, you could argue that the woman would end up giving up a lot in the process, or that she is a loss to her family because she is going to join the husband's family. Yeah. So in that context, then I think it makes sense. But otherwise, I feel like it's a very one-sided thing, especially in modern day, where a lot of us who live in the cities, for example, are not really doing manual labor. And so if we leave our parents' home, they're not really losing a laborer. Another thing that has really cropped up and I've observed along the way over time is that sometimes parents start to see their daughter as a source of wealth. One of the things that you notice is a lot of mention of, for example, the value of the girl as pertains to her education and the kind of jobs she's had and the kind of care that she got from her own family. And it kind of makes, I don't know, it's very strange to, it's like you're selling, you know, it's like I bought something, like a painting. I bought it before it was of high value, and then the artist started to gain popularity and the value of the pieces increases and increases, and then when it reaches a certain threshold, I sell out my art and I make my money back. And I would just hate to feel like my parents felt like I was some sort of burden that they have to be paid back for. So yeah, that is a con to me because it kind of puts the value of the woman into a monetary thing and also kind of sees her as a burden to her parents or her family. Yeah, so that's something I would see definitely as a con. In certain traditional contexts as well, you find that it actually leads to more practices of early marriage. And I have seen contexts like this, for example, in Samburu up north in Kenya, you find sometimes girls being pulled out of school, primary school, high school, and married off to an older man because the parents are hard on cash and need some money or need some property, or they're poor, and they basically sell their child off for material property. And so I find that to be very, terrible. So I want to talk about my personal opinion or thoughts on the practice. One of the ways that this came to mind, and I thought, I want to do a podcast about it. I was in a government office and I was looking to expedite some documents which were taking really long to come by. And I remember just meeting this man in the office there, and he asks me about, so you're married, did your husband pay bride price? And my husband, I guess for context, is actually not African, so this is not a practice that is done in their culture. And it was just really funny to me that a complete stranger would come up to me with such, I feel, a very personal question. So anyway, because I needed help, I kind of continued with the conversation and I tried to keep it light and I guess not really go off on the man. But it was very interesting that this was something of relevance to someone who was a stranger to me and is also not really from my culture. And so I found that really interesting. And I remember just saying, no, I actually wasn't keen on it. So we didn't do that. We didn't do the bride price. And he said, but what about your parents? And I said, actually, my parents really didn't care so much for it. Whether it happened or didn't happen, didn't matter much to them. And I did tell them that I wasn't for it, and so they were okay with it. And the conversation continued, and it went left in many ways. But then it just kind of got me to think, like, because he said, well, you don't get to decide whether your bride price is paid or not because you are not the one who birthed yourself. And so I just thought, wow, that's really, really interesting. It's something I would love to discuss. And I personally have been against the idea of bride price since I was very young. This might have something to do with the fact that I wasn't raised in a very traditional culture, born and raised in the city, amongst so many different cultures. Everyone had their own practices, and sometimes there were similar ones that were shared. But some of these things I didn't even learn about beyond just kind of maybe in school, as I mentioned, in a study or like geography or history or something, or culture studies. And I didn't really know people who did it until much later. So when I grew older and my friends would start to get married, I remember now noticing, oh wow, people still do this, and wow, I don't know, it just feels really weird to me, and it just doesn't feel right. And one of the reasons it didn't feel right to me was because I just felt like it wasn't equal. So equal in the sense that is one member of this couple more valuable than the other? Because a lot of times people would say, hey, it's just a gesture, it's a goodwill gesture to say thank you for, like a jewel. They call the woman a jewel and so on. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thought. But at the same time, it's like, what about the man? Is he not valuable? Is he not some kind of, why is there no exchange both ways? Why is it just one-sided? So that's one of the ways that I found it to just be like, this doesn't really click for me, and it doesn't really make sense. And I personally wouldn't want to have somebody pay for me when I get married. I would like for it to be a mutual decision between us, and that there's no transaction beyond, just us deciding, okay, we want to do this together, and talking to our families and telling them about it, even rather than asking for permission. And this is where I really come off as atraditional, and you know what, maybe I am. I guess I should just own it. But so I found that to be very strange, and especially because I just think honestly it's not really relevant in the modern day, where I'm not growing up in a farm where I'm helping my parents out, and then if I get married, now they don't have a worker anymore. So those kind of things just are no longer relevant. So I feel like the practice also loses its relevance. Does the practice of bride price bear any relevance in the modern world? If it were up to me, I'd do away with it altogether. But that's just me, and I feel like maybe there are people who have different opinions. I think we can still look back on the positives of it, but just maybe it's time to relegate these practices into antiquity. An alternative, I guess, would be to have a party and both sides of the family give presents. And again, I don't have a very clear idea of how every single community in Kenya practices this marriage tradition. Is there a mutuality in the practice of marriage in traditional culture that I've not come across? Please share that with me. I'm very curious to hear about it. That doesn't feel like it puts more weight on one party than on the other. But I do feel like it would be nicer if we kind of made it more of a mutual practice, and maybe had a party or continued with these ceremonies, but let go of the transactional aspects of it, or the parts of it that become exorbitant and start to leave a sour taste in the mouth, and start to even cause a bit of friction between the couple, because maybe the man feels really pressured to give much more than he's able to. I mean, again, like I mentioned, there are couples where the woman is earning more than the man, and then she ends up paying her bride price. So what's the point? Is she paying her parents for herself? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't really make sense. So in many ways, it doesn't add up anymore. There are also situations where people start to cause friction amongst their friends because they are asking for contributions towards their bride price, and then this merry-go-round where I ask you to contribute towards my bride price through fundraising, and then when it's your turn, you have to pay, and then it's just this cost that people have to incur that we can just do away with altogether. I mean, people are often complaining about the economy, and lately it's been quite tough on a lot of us. So is this a good reason to just get rid of bride price altogether? I feel like it's a substantial reason to say, hey, why don't we kick these practices to the curb and start to do it a little bit differently? I mean, at the same time, also because a lot of Kenyans are both cultural and Christian at the same time, that means you have two weddings. You have the traditional wedding and the church wedding, and both cost a lot of money. So how about if people just chose one rather than both? I'm just throwing it out there. Do share your opinions about this because yeah, I think it would be a very interesting discussion to have. I would love to hear opposing ideas as long as they're shared with respect. I'm happy to have a dialogue as well. If you feel like you have very strong points for why we should continue with this practice and even maybe how we can alter it to be much more relevant to the modern day, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so I must recognize the role that the government plays in creating laws that mitigate negative impacts of such practices. According to my research, both the Kenyan and Ugandan governments have laid out laws that have either discouraged extremely high bride price or the paying back of bride price upon divorce, although they've not been really specific about what is high. So I don't know how much that helps in the process, but the law does help along the way to protect people from being either extorted or being blackmailed or being put in harm or in danger because of the payment of bride price or the repaying of it upon incidences of divorce. So I want to acknowledge that, and I would love to hear much more in terms of what the laws are. And you know what, I think this is a conversation that I can have over and over with different people who can shed more light on it, and I guess how it's evolved over time, because in this episode I was really talking more about what it is and what I think about it and why I think it shouldn't continue to be practiced. But maybe there are arguments for it, and maybe there are ways that it has evolved to adapt to modern culture. So that's it for today. Until I see you next week, have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye. I've been your host, Sheila Bett.